Captain James Mitchell had served the royal family for 15 years. Every morning he walked through the grand hallways of the palace with pride in his steps. His uniform was always perfect, his shoes polished until they shined like mirrors. The other guards looked up to him. The royal staff respected him. Even the Queen herself had once told him he was one of their most trusted protectors. But today felt different. Today something was bothering James in a way he couldn't explain. As he stood outside Prince George's private study, he noticed the young prince sitting by the window. The 11-year-old boy wasn't playing with toys or reading books like most children his age. Instead, he was watching the gardeners work outside with a strange sadness in his eyes. Prince George had always been a quiet child. While his younger siblings ran around and laughed loudly, George preferred to observe the world around him. The palace staff often whispered about how mature he seemed for his age. Some said it was because he knew he would one day be king. Others believed he was naturally thoughtful. But James saw something deeper in the boy's silence. The captain remembered his own childhood. He grew up in a small village where everyone knew each other's names. Children played in muddy fields and came home with dirty clothes and big smiles. They didn't have bodyguards following them everywhere. They didn't have to wave at crowds of strangers or attend formal dinners where they couldn't speak unless spoken to. As James watched Prince George through the doorway, he saw the boy trace his finger along the window glass. Outside, a group of children from the nearby town were having a picnic with their families in the public park that bordered the palace grounds. They were laughing, running around, and sharing sandwiches on checkered blankets. George's eyes followed their every movement. The prince's tutor, Mrs. Henderson, entered the room with a stack of history books. She began talking about kings and queens from centuries past, about duty and responsibility. George nodded politely and answered her questions correctly. But James noticed the boy's gaze kept drifting back to the window. During lunch, James stood at his usual position near the dining room door. The royal family ate in silence, using proper silverware and maintaining perfect posture. Prince George cut his food into small, neat pieces and chewed quietly. When his little sister, Princess Charlotte, giggled at something their father said, George smiled slightly but remained silent. After the meal, James followed his routine of checking the palace security. He walked through each room, tested every lock, and spoke with the other guards. But his mind kept returning to the image of Prince George at the window. There was something about the boy's expression that reminded James of a bird trapped in a golden cage. That evening, as James prepared to end his shift, he passed by the prince's bedroom. The door was slightly open and he could hear Prince George talking quietly to his nanny. The boy was asking questions that surprised the captain. He wanted to know what it felt like to choose your own friends. He wondered if other children ever felt lonely even when surrounded by people. James stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the innocent questions of a child who had everything except freedom. The weight of his 15 years of service suddenly felt heavier on his shoulders. He had always believed he was protecting something precious. Now he wondered if he was also part of what was keeping that precious thing trapped. Walking home to his small apartment outside the palace grounds, James thought about his own life. He had dedicated everything to serving the crown. He had no wife, no children of his own, no hobbies outside of his duty. His entire identity was built around being Captain James Mitchell, Royal Guard. But watching Prince George today made him question whether protection could sometimes become a prison. The streets outside the palace were quiet at night. James could see lights in ordinary houses where ordinary families were probably sharing ordinary moments together. Children were likely being tucked into bed by parents who didn't have to worry about photographers hiding in bushes or strangers wanting to touch their kids. As he reached his apartment, James realized that tomorrow would bring another day of the same routine. Prince George would wake up in his grand bedroom, eat breakfast in the formal dining room, study with his tutors, and watch the world from behind windows and security barriers. The boy would continue to grow up in isolation, prepared for a role he never chose, surrounded by people who served him but couldn't truly befriend him. James hung up his uniform and looked at himself in the mirror. For the first time in 15 years, he wondered if there was a better way to serve the young prince than simply following orders and maintaining distance. The boy's silent questions echoed in his mind as he tried to fall asleep. Something needed to change, but James wasn't sure what or how. The loyal captain had no idea that tomorrow would bring an encounter that would change everything he believed about duty, service, and what it truly meant to protect someone you cared about. The next morning brought heavy rain to the palace grounds. James arrived early, as always, but found the usual morning routine disrupted. Prince George was nowhere to be found in his study or breakfast room. After a quick search, James discovered the boy standing in the palace's old greenhouse, a place rarely visited by the royal family. The greenhouse was filled with exotic plants from around the world, but it also housed a small section where the palace gardeners grew simple vegetables and herbs. Prince George was kneeling beside a row of tomato plants, carefully examining the leaves with genuine curiosity. His expensive clothes were getting dirty from the soil, but he didn't seem to care. James approached quietly, unsure whether to interrupt. Palace protocol required him to maintain a professional distance, but something about the scene made him hesitate. The prince looked more relaxed and natural than James had ever seen him. For the first time, the boy seemed like just a regular 11-year-old exploring something that fascinated him. "Captain Mitchell," Prince George said without looking up, "did you know that these plants need different amounts of water depending on the weather? Mr. Thompson, the head gardener, taught me yesterday. When it rains like today, they don't need as much watering because they can collect moisture naturally." James was surprised. In all his years of service, Prince George had never spoken to him about anything other than formal greetings and polite responses. Now the boy was sharing something he had learned, something that clearly excited him. "That's very interesting, Your Highness," James replied, using the proper title but keeping his voice gentle. "Mr. Thompson is indeed very knowledgeable about plants." Prince George finally looked up, soil smudged on his cheek. "He also told me that plants grow better when they have room to spread their roots. If you keep them in pots that are too small, they become weak and sad." The boy paused, then added quietly, "I think people might be like that too." The words hit James like a lightning bolt. This young prince, who wasn't even 12 years old, had just expressed something profound about his own situation, without directly complaining or asking for pity. He was sharing an observation that revealed how deeply he understood his own circumstances. James knelt down beside the prince, forgetting protocol for a moment. "You're right about that, Your Highness. Both plants and people need space to grow properly." He looked at the healthy tomato plants around them, but they also need protection from storms and pests. It's about finding the right balance. For the next 20 minutes, James found himself in the most genuine conversation he had ever had with any member of the royal family. Prince George asked questions about James's life before becoming a guard. He wanted to know about James's childhood, about the games he played and the friends he made. The prince listened with intense interest to stories about climbing trees, building forts, and getting into harmless trouble with neighborhood kids. "Did your parents ever worry about you when you went exploring?" Prince George asked. "Of course they did," James answered honestly. "But they also knew that children need to discover things for themselves. They trusted me to be careful, and they taught me how to recognize real danger versus imaginary fears." Prince George nodded thoughtfully. "I think my parents worry about everything. Sometimes I feel like everyone sees danger in places where there might not be any." He touched one of the tomato plants gently. "Like these plants. They look delicate, but Mr. Thompson says they're actually quite strong if you give them what they need." The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Henderson, the prince's tutor, who had been searching for her missing student. She looked disapproving when she saw Prince George's dirty clothes and the informal way James was kneeling beside him. "Your Highness, you missed your morning mathematics lesson," she said sternly, "and your clothes are quite unsuitable for royal appearances." Prince George's expression immediately changed. The spark of curiosity and joy faded from his eyes, replaced by the polite, distant mask he wore during formal activities. He stood up, brushed off his clothes, and apologized for his absence. As they walked back toward the main palace, James noticed how the prince's shoulders slumped slightly. The boy, who had been animated and engaged just moments before now, moved like someone much older, carrying invisible weights. During the mathematics lesson that followed, James stood at his usual post outside the study door. Through the gap, he could see Prince George sitting perfectly straight, answering questions correctly but mechanically. The tutor praised his intelligence, but James could see that the boy's mind was elsewhere. At lunch, the royal family discussed the prince's upcoming public appearances. There would be a charity event next week where he would need to shake hands with hundreds of strangers, smile for photographers, and make a brief speech about helping children in need. Prince George listened to the instructions with no expression on his face. That afternoon, James made a decision that would change everything. While Prince George was having his afternoon rest period, James went to find Mr. Thompson, the head gardener. He wanted to learn more about the greenhouse and the work being done there. Mr. Thompson was delighted to share his knowledge. He explained how the greenhouse provided a controlled environment where plants could thrive while still experiencing natural elements like rain and sunshine. He spoke passionately about teaching young people to connect with nature and understand how living things grow. "That young prince has a real gift for this," Mr. Thompson said with pride. Yesterday was the first time he'd ever been allowed to get his hands dirty, and he took to it like a natural. Kept asking thoughtful questions and really listened to the answers. Most adults don't pay that kind of attention. James learned that Prince George had specifically requested to visit the greenhouse after seeing Mr. Thompson working through his study window. The boy had been watching the gardener for weeks, curious about what he was doing but never allowed to investigate. As James walked back through the palace that evening, he carried with him a new understanding. Prince George wasn't just a lonely child. He was an intelligent, curious young person whose natural instincts were being suppressed by excessive protection and rigid scheduling. The boy needed more than safety and education. He needed opportunities to explore, to make mistakes, and to form genuine connections with people who saw him as more than just a future king. That night, James sat in his apartment and wrote something he had never written before, a letter of concern about Prince George's emotional well-being. He wasn't sure who he would give it to, or even if he would have the courage to submit it. But for the first time in his career, he felt that his duty as a protector might require him to protect the prince from more than just physical threats. 3 days after writing the letter, James still carried it in his uniform pocket, unsent and undelivered. He had read it so many times that he knew every word by heart. The letter respectfully suggested that Prince George might benefit from more informal interactions and hands-on learning experiences. It questioned whether the current level of isolation was necessary for a child his age. But submitting such a letter felt like crossing a line that James had never even considered approaching in 15 years of service. Royal guards were supposed to protect and follow orders, not offer opinions about child rearing or question established protocols. James worried that speaking up might cost him his position, but staying silent felt like failing in his duty to protect Prince George's emotional well-being. The decision was made for him when he witnessed something that broke his heart completely. During a formal garden party for visiting dignitaries, James watched Prince George perform his royal duties with practiced perfection. The boy shook hands with dozens of adults, smiled politely for countless photographs, and delivered a short speech about international friendship that he had clearly memorized. Throughout the entire event, James noticed that Prince George never once acted like a child. He didn't run, laugh loudly, or show genuine excitement about anything. When other children at the event played games on the lawn, George watched from a distance but never joined them. His security detail and formal schedule prevented any spontaneous interactions. The breaking point came when a little girl, about Prince George's age, approached him with a drawing she had made. The picture showed stick figures holding hands under a rainbow with "Friends Forever" written in colorful crayon letters. She shyly offered it to the prince as a gift. Prince George's face lit up with genuine delight as he looked at the drawing. For a moment, he was just a regular kid receiving a thoughtful present from another child. He started to say something enthusiastic about the rainbow colors, but Mrs. Henderson quickly intervened. "Thank you, dear," she said to the little girl while smoothly taking the drawing from Prince George's hands. "His Highness appreciates your artwork very much." She then guided Prince George away before he could respond, explaining that they needed to move on to the next scheduled activity. James saw the confusion and disappointment in both children's faces. The little girl didn't understand why the prince couldn't talk to her normally. Prince George didn't understand why a simple, kind gesture had to be interrupted and managed by adults. The drawing disappeared into Mrs. Henderson's bag, probably never to be seen again. That evening, James made his choice. He requested a private meeting with Sir David Crawford, the Queen's private secretary, one of the most senior officials in the royal household. Sir David was known for being approachable despite his high position, and James hoped he would listen with an open mind. The meeting took place in Sir David's elegant office, filled with portraits of previous monarchs and shelves of leather-bound books. James had never been in such a formal setting for a personal conversation, and he felt nervous but determined. "Captain Mitchell," Sir David said warmly, "please sit down. I understand you wanted to discuss something important regarding your duties." James took a deep breath and pulled out his letter. "Sir David, I've served this family faithfully for 15 years. I've never questioned orders or overstepped my boundaries. But I'm concerned about Prince George's emotional development, and I believe my duty as his protector extends beyond just physical security." He handed over the letter and waited while Sir David read it carefully. The older man's expression remained neutral, but James could see him considering each point seriously. "These are thoughtful observations, Captain," Sir David said finally. "You're suggesting that Prince George needs more opportunities for normal childhood experiences and genuine social interactions." "Yes, sir. The boy is intelligent and curious, but he's becoming isolated in ways that might affect his ability to connect with people when he's older. Yesterday, I watched him light up when another child gave him a simple drawing, but the interaction was cut short by protocol. He needs chances to just be a kid sometimes." Sir David leaned back in his chair, studying James carefully. "You realize you're questioning decades of established security and educational procedures. These protocols exist for very good reasons. Prince George's safety and proper preparation for his future role are paramount." "I understand that completely, sir," James replied. "I'm not suggesting we abandon security or proper education, but there might be ways to provide both protection and normal experiences. The prince spends hours watching other children through windows. He asks questions about friendship and freedom that show he's aware of what he's missing." Sir David was quiet for several minutes, and James worried that he had made a terrible mistake. Finally, the private secretary spoke again. "Captain Mitchell, your dedication to Prince George's well-being is commendable. However, implementing changes to royal protocols requires careful consideration and approval from the highest levels. These decisions involve not just the prince's parents, but security experts, educators, and even government officials." James felt his heart sinking. He had expected this response, but it still disappointed him. "I understand, sir. I just hoped that someone might listen and consider whether we're protecting the prince so much that we're preventing him from developing normally." "Your concerns are noted and will be considered," Sir David said formally. Then his tone became more personal. "Off the record, Captain, you're not the first person to raise these issues. Some of us have observed the same things you've described, but change in the royal household happens slowly, if at all." As James left the meeting, he felt both relieved and frustrated. He had done what he believed was right by speaking up, but it seemed unlikely that anything would actually change. Prince George would continue his isolated, heavily managed existence while his childhood slipped away, one carefully scheduled day at a time. Walking through the palace corridors that night, James passed Prince George's bedroom. Through the slightly open door, he could hear the boy talking quietly to himself. The prince was practicing conversations with imaginary friends, creating scenarios where children played together without adults interrupting or managing every interaction. James stood there listening to this private moment, feeling more certain than ever that his concerns were valid. The prince wasn't just lonely. He was actively longing for connections and experiences that his position made nearly impossible to achieve. Something had to change, even if the royal household wasn't ready to admit it. 2 weeks passed without any response to James's letter. Life at the palace continued with its usual rigid schedule, but James found himself watching Prince George with new eyes. Every controlled interaction and missed opportunity for normal childhood experiences now felt more significant. The boy continued to perform his duties perfectly, while growing more distant from the world around him. Then, unexpectedly, everything changed in a single moment that nobody could have predicted. During a routine morning walk through the palace gardens, Prince George's small entourage was passing by the main gates when they heard shouting from the street. A delivery truck had broken down, and several boxes of fresh flowers for the palace had spilled across the road. The truck driver, An elderly man named Arthur was clearly distressed as he tried to gather the scattered blooms. Some of the flowers were being blown away by the wind, and passing cars were crushing others. Arthur looked like he might cry as he watched his hard work being destroyed. Without thinking, Prince George stopped walking and stared at the scene through the ornate iron gates. His security detail and Mrs. Henderson expected him to continue with their planned route, but the prince remained frozen, watching Arthur struggle. "We should help him," Prince George said quietly. Mrs. Henderson immediately responded with the expected protocol. "Your Highness, we cannot involve ourselves in street incidents. The palace staff will handle this matter appropriately." But Prince George didn't move. He watched as Arthur, who was probably in his 70s, bent over repeatedly to pick up heavy boxes while worried about his ruined delivery. Other pedestrians walked past without offering assistance, too busy with their own lives to notice an old man's distress. "He needs help now," Prince George said with unusual firmness. "Not later when the staff handles it appropriately." James watched this exchange with growing interest. For the first time, he was seeing Prince George push back against the rules that governed his life. The boy wasn't being defiant or rude. He was simply responding to his natural instinct to help someone in need. Mrs. Henderson began explaining why royal protocol prevented such involvement. But Prince George had already made his decision. He walked to the gate, opened it himself, and stepped onto the public street before anyone could stop him. The security team immediately went into high alert mode. James and 2 other guards quickly surrounded the prince while Mrs. Henderson protested that this was completely inappropriate and potentially dangerous. But Prince George ignored all of them and approached Arthur. "Excuse me, sir," the prince said politely. "Would you like some help with your flowers?" Arthur looked up, confused and overwhelmed. He clearly didn't recognize the well-dressed boy who had appeared among the security guards, but the offer of help was exactly what he needed. "That's very kind of you, young man," Arthur said gratefully. "These old bones aren't as quick as they used to be." What followed was 15 minutes that James would remember for the rest of his life. Prince George, still surrounded by nervous security guards and an increasingly flustered tutor, worked alongside Arthur to collect the scattered flowers. The boy got his expensive clothes dirty, carried heavy boxes, and engaged in genuine conversation with the truck driver. Arthur told Prince George about his flower business, how he had been delivering to the palace for over 20 years, and how much pride he took in providing the freshest blooms for royal events. Prince George listened with genuine interest, asked thoughtful questions, and shared his own love of gardens and growing things. During their work, a small crowd gathered to watch the unusual scene. People began helping when they saw a well-dressed boy working so hard to assist the elderly man. Soon, there were a dozen strangers working together to save Arthur's delivery, all because Prince George had been willing to ignore protocol and do what felt right. James realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. Prince George wasn't just helping Arthur, he was inspiring others to help too. The boy's natural kindness and leadership were creating exactly the kind of positive impact that royal training was supposed to achieve. But this was happening spontaneously, rather than through formal events and scripted speeches. When all the flowers were collected and loaded back onto the truck, Arthur shook Prince George's hand with tears in his eyes. "You're a good lad," he said warmly. "Your parents raised you right. Not many young people would stop their day to help an old stranger." Prince George smiled genuinely for the first time in weeks. "Thank you, Mr. Arthur. I hope your deliveries go well from now on." It wasn't until Arthur drove away that some of the crowd members began to realize who the helpful boy might have been. James heard whispered conversations as people compared the boy's face to newspaper photos. By the time they returned to the palace, Mrs. Henderson was pale with worry about the potential publicity and security implications. But Prince George seemed transformed. He walked with more energy and purpose than James had seen in months. The boy had experienced something that no amount of formal education could provide: the satisfaction of helping someone who genuinely needed assistance and the joy of connecting with regular people in a meaningful way that afternoon. While Prince George attended his regular lessons, James overheard conversations throughout the palace. Some staff members were concerned about the breach of protocol, but others were quietly praising the prince's actions. Mr. Thompson, the gardener, told anyone who would listen how proud he was that the boy had shown such compassion and Initiative. James realized that Prince George's spontaneous decision to help Arthur had accomplished something that months of formal royal training could never achieve. The boy had demonstrated real leadership, genuine compassion, and the ability to inspire others, all qualities that would serve him well as a future king. More importantly, for those 15 minutes on the street, Prince George had been allowed to act on his natural instincts and connect with people as equals rather than subjects. The experience had clearly energized and fulfilled him in ways that formal duties never could. As James reflected on the day's events, he understood that this incident would have consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Prince George had tasted what it felt like to act freely and make a real difference in someone's life. The boy would not easily forget that feeling, and James suspected it would change how the prince viewed his role and his relationship with the world around him. The question now was whether the royal household would see this incident as a problem to prevent in the future or as an opportunity to reconsider how they were preparing Prince George for his eventual role as king. The consequences of Prince George's street incident came swiftly and were more severe than James had anticipated. Within 24 hours, new security protocols were implemented that essentially eliminated any possibility of spontaneous interactions between the prince and the public. Additional guards were assigned. Walking routes were changed to avoid areas where crowds might gather, and Mrs. Henderson received strict instructions to maintain closer supervision. James watched Prince George's reaction to these changes with growing concern. The boy didn't protest or complain, but the light that had appeared in his eyes after helping Arthur gradually faded. During lessons, the prince answered questions correctly but mechanically. During meals, he ate in silence. During public appearances, he smiled and waved, but James could see that the boy was retreating deeper into himself. The breaking point came during a formal dinner with visiting diplomats. Prince George performed his duties flawlessly, greeting guests with perfect manners and making appropriate conversation when spoken to. But James noticed something that others missed. Throughout the entire evening, the prince never once initiated a conversation or showed genuine interest in any topic discussed. After the guests left, James followed his routine of securing the palace for the night. As he passed Prince George's study, he heard something that made him stop completely. The boy was crying, not the loud, dramatic tears of a tantrum, but the quiet, hopeless sobs of someone who felt trapped with no way out. James stood outside the door, listening to Prince George's whispered words between sobs. The boy was talking to himself about Arthur, wondering if the old man was still delivering flowers, hoping he was well. Prince George whispered that he wished he could see Arthur again, but knew it would never be allowed. "I helped him," the prince said to himself. "I actually helped someone and it felt so good. But now I can't help anyone anymore. I can't even choose who to talk to or where to walk. Everything is decided for me. Every single thing." James felt tears in his own eyes as he heard the raw pain in the child's voice. Prince George wasn't just lonely anymore. He was beginning to understand that his entire life would be lived within invisible walls, making connections only when protocol allowed, helping people only through formal charity events where real relationships were impossible. The next morning, James made a decision that would end his career but might save Prince George's soul. He requested an emergency meeting with Sir David Crawford, not as a routine report but as an urgent matter requiring immediate attention. When they met, James didn't hold back anything. He described Prince George's emotional state, the boy's growing despair, and his genuine belief that the current approach was damaging the child's development in ways that would affect his ability to be an effective king in the future. "Sir David," James said with unusual directness, "Prince George is learning that helping people leads to punishment. He's learning that showing genuine emotions results in tighter restrictions. We're teaching him to be distant and disconnected from the very people he'll one day be expected to lead and serve." Sir David listened carefully, but his response was predictable. "Captain Mitchell, I understand your concerns, but the safety and proper development of the future king requires certain sacrifices. Prince George will learn to appreciate his unique position and the responsibilities that come with it." "With respect, sir," James replied. "What if we're wrong? What if Prince George learns to see his subjects as threats to be avoided, rather than people to be served? What if we're creating a king who can't connect with his people because we never allowed him to learn how?" The conversation continued for over an hour, with James presenting every argument he could think of. He talked about the importance of emotional intelligence in leadership, the value of understanding ordinary people's struggles, and the risk of raising a ruler who felt no genuine connection to those he governed. Sir David's final response devastated James but didn't surprise him. "Captain Mitchell, your dedication to Prince George is commendable, but your perspective is not aligned with the established wisdom of royal tradition. Perhaps it would be best if you considered a transfer to other duties within the palace or sought employment elsewhere." James knew this moment had been inevitable from the moment he first questioned the system. "Sir David, if my choice is between keeping my position and staying silent while Prince George suffers, then I choose the prince's well-being. I'll submit my resignation today." That afternoon, James wrote 2 letters. The first was his formal resignation from the Royal Guard, effective in 2 weeks. The second was a detailed report documenting every observation he had made about Prince George's emotional state, complete with specific incidents and recommendations for changes that might help the boy develop into a more balanced and effective future leader. James knew the second letter would probably be ignored or dismissed, but he felt compelled to create a record of his concerns. Someday, when Prince George was older, someone might wonder why he seemed disconnected from his people or struggled with genuine relationships. This letter would provide answers and perhaps prevent future problems. Before submitting either letter, James decided to say goodbye to Prince George in his own way. He couldn't tell the boy about his resignation. That would be inappropriate and potentially upsetting. But he wanted to leave Prince George with some small sign that someone had understood his struggles and cared about his happiness. James went to Mr. Thompson, the gardener, and together they prepared a small gift. It was a tiny potted plant, a young tomato seedling that Prince George could keep in his room and care for himself. Attached was a note explaining how to help the plant grow and thrive, written in simple language that emphasized the importance of giving living things both protection and freedom to develop naturally. The note ended with words that James hoped Prince George would understand, both now and in the future. Some of the best leaders are those who remember what it feels like to be small and need help. Never forget that feeling, and never stop wanting to help others feel less alone. That evening, James left the small plant on Prince George's desk, where the boy would find it when he returned from dinner. Then he walked through the palace corridors one last time as Captain James Mitchell, Royal Guard, protector of Prince George. Tomorrow he would begin the process of leaving the only life he had known for 15 years. But he would leave knowing that he had tried to protect something more precious than Prince George's physical safety. He had tried to protect the boy's capacity for genuine human connection and natural compassion. James didn't know if his efforts would make any difference in the long term, but he hoped that someday, somehow, Prince George would remember that at least one person had seen his struggle and had been willing to sacrifice everything to try to help him. James's final 2 weeks at the palace passed in a strange mixture of normalcy and emotional tension. He continued his duties professionally, but every interaction with Prince George carried the weight of unspoken goodbye. The boy had found the tomato plant and seemed to treasure it, checking on it each morning and evening. But James couldn't acknowledge the gift without breaking protocol. On his third-to-last day, something unexpected happened that would change everything James thought he knew about his impact on Prince George's life. While standing guard outside the prince's study during a tutoring session, James overheard a conversation that stopped him cold. Mrs. Henderson was reviewing the prince's upcoming schedule when Prince George interrupted her with an unusual request. "Mrs. Henderson, I want to write a letter to someone, but I need to know how to find their address." "Of course, Your Highness. Who would you like to write to?" "The flower delivery man, Arthur. I want to make sure he's doing well and thank him again for teaching me about his work." Mrs. Henderson's response was swift and predictable. "Your Highness, that kind of personal correspondence with members of the public is not appropriate. If you wish to express gratitude, we can arrange for the palace to send a formal thank you note." "No," Prince George said with quiet firmness. "I want to write to him myself in my own words. He was kind to me and I want to be kind back." "That seems like something a good person would do." James heard Mrs. Henderson explaining royal protocol, but he also heard something else. Prince George politely but persistently questioning why kindness should be limited by rules. The boy wasn't being rebellious. He was applying logic and basic human decency to a situation where protocol seemed to conflict with simple goodness. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Prince George calmly presenting arguments that sounded remarkably mature for an 11-year-old. He spoke about leadership requiring genuine connections with people, about the importance of showing gratitude for kindness received, and about wanting to be the kind of person who followed through on relationships rather than treating people as disposable encounters. James realized he was hearing the voice of a future king who was developing his own moral compass, one that sometimes pointed in directions that challenged traditional royal behavior. Prince George wasn't rejecting his role or responsibilities. He was trying to figure out how to fulfill them in ways that felt authentic and meaningful. That evening, James made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of waiting for his resignation to take effect, he requested one final meeting with Sir David Crawford. This time he didn't go to complain or argue about Prince George's treatment. Instead, he went to share something he thought the royal household needed to understand. "Sir David," James began, "I've spent 2 weeks listening to Prince George respond to the changes made after the flower incident. I think you need to know what I've observed." Sir David looked tired and somewhat irritated. "Captain Mitchell, we've already discussed your concerns. The decision has been made about your transfer and new protocols are in place. This isn't about my concerns anymore," James replied. "This is about what Prince George is teaching himself in response to our restrictions. He's not becoming more compliant or accepting of his limitations. He's becoming more determined to find ways to connect authentically with people, even if it means challenging the system." James described the conversation he had overheard about Arthur, emphasizing Prince George's logical arguments and mature reasoning. He explained how the boy was developing leadership skills and moral principles that could make him an extraordinary king, but only if those qualities were nurtured rather than suppressed. Prince George isn't fighting against his royal destiny, James concluded. He's trying to figure out how to be a good king in ways that feel genuine to him. The question is whether we want to support that development or force him to choose between being royal and being human. Sir David listened without interrupting, and for the first time James saw genuine uncertainty in the man's expression. After a long silence, Sir David asked a question that revealed he had been thinking about these issues more than he had previously admitted. "Captain Mitchell, if you were designing a system to prepare Prince George for future leadership, while still maintaining necessary security and protocol, what would you change?" James was prepared for this question because he had been thinking about it for weeks. He outlined a plan that would maintain all essential security measures, while creating structured opportunities for Prince George to interact with regular people in controlled but meaningful ways. He suggested mentorship programs with carefully vetted adults who could teach the prince practical skills, supervised volunteer work at local charities, and educational experiences that took place outside palace walls. The goal wouldn't be to eliminate protection, James explained, but to expand the definition of what Prince George needs protection from. Right now, we're protecting him from normal human experiences that he'll need to understand if he's going to lead effectively. Sir David took notes throughout James's presentation, asking detailed questions about implementation, security considerations, and potential benefits. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours and felt more like a collaborative planning session than a resignation meeting. As the meeting concluded, Sir David made a statement that shocked James completely. "Captain Mitchell, I'm going to ask you to withdraw your resignation temporarily. I want to present your ideas to a small committee that includes the Prince and Princess of Wales. If they're interested in piloting some of these approaches, I'd like you to help develop and oversee the implementation." James felt his world shift in a way he hadn't expected. "Sir David, are you saying that Prince George's parents might actually consider changing how he's being raised?" "I'm saying that they've been having their own concerns about their son's development, and your observations might provide solutions they've been looking for. Prince George's parents want him to be prepared for kingship, but they also want him to be happy and emotionally healthy." That night, James walked through the palace with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in months. Prince George's silent but persistent efforts to maintain his humanity within royal constraints had accomplished something that direct complaints and formal protests had failed to achieve. The boy's authentic responses to restriction had revealed to the adults around him that their current approach might be flawed. James realized that Prince George had been leading all along, not through rebellion or dramatic gestures, but through consistent demonstration of the kind of person he wanted to become. The prince's quiet determination to remain connected to others despite every obstacle placed in his path had finally forced the system to reconsider whether those obstacles were necessary or helpful. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities that James had never imagined when he first wrote his letter of concern. Prince George's silent but impactful choices had created an opportunity for real change, and James would have the chance to help build a better system for preparing the future king. 6 months later, James stood in the same greenhouse where his journey with Prince George had begun, but everything else had changed completely. The boy who had once knelt alone among the tomato plants was now teaching a group of local children about plant care, while Mr. Thompson supervised from nearby. Prince George's clothes were dirty, his face was bright with excitement, and his laughter echoed naturally through the glass walls. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The committee meetings with Prince George's parents had been lengthy and sometimes tense, with security experts and traditional advisors raising concerns about every proposed change. But Prince George's mother and father had seen their son's growing withdrawal and unhappiness, and they ultimately decided that raising a healthy, emotionally intelligent future king was worth taking some calculated risks. James's new role as special assistant for Prince George's community integration was unlike any position that had existed in royal households before. He worked with a small team to create opportunities for the prince to interact with regular people while maintaining appropriate security and learning valuable lessons about leadership and service. The children's gardening program was just one of several initiatives they had developed. Prince George spent 2 afternoons each week working alongside local students, learning practical skills while teaching others what he had discovered about plants and growing things. The program was carefully managed, but it felt natural and unforced to everyone involved. The changes extended far beyond the greenhouse. Prince George now participated in a mentorship program, where he spent time with professionals from various fields: doctors, teachers, engineers, and social workers who could share their expertise and perspectives on serving others. He volunteered at a local food bank once a month, where his job was simply to help pack meals and talk with families who needed assistance. Most importantly, Prince George had been allowed to write his letter to Arthur, the flower delivery man. That correspondence had grown into a genuine friendship, with Arthur visiting the palace occasionally to share his knowledge of flowers and plants. The old man treated Prince George like any other young person interested in gardening, offering advice, sharing stories, and providing the kind of normal, intergenerational relationship that had been missing from the prince's life. James watched Prince George interact with the children in the greenhouse and marveled at the boy's natural leadership abilities. The prince wasn't directing or commanding. He was collaborating and encouraging. He celebrated when other children succeeded, offered help when they struggled, and shared credit for every accomplishment. These were qualities that no formal education could have taught him, but they emerged naturally when he was given opportunities to practice them in real situations. The academic benefits had been unexpected but significant. Prince George's regular tutoring sessions were now enhanced by practical applications of everything he learned. History lessons included visits to local museums where he could see artifacts and talk with curators. Geography studies involved meeting people from different countries who lived in nearby communities. Mathematics became relevant when he helped calculate seed spacing in gardens or measure ingredients for food bank meals. Mrs. Henderson, initially resistant to the changes, had become one of the program's strongest supporters when she saw how engaged and motivated Prince George became with his studies. The boy who had once answered questions mechanically now brought enthusiasm and real-world connections to every subject. The most remarkable change was in Prince George's confidence and emotional stability. The quiet, withdrawn child who had spent months watching the world through windows was now actively participating in that world. He still maintained royal dignity and proper behavior, but these qualities now seemed natural rather than forced. James had also undergone his own transformation. From a security guard focused solely on physical protection, he had become something like a guardian of Prince George's emotional and social development. His job now required creativity, empathy, and constant communication with teachers, community leaders, and families who participated in various programs. The success of the initiative had attracted attention from other royal households around the world, with several requesting information about how they might implement similar programs for their own young family members. James found himself consulting with palace officials from different countries, sharing what they had learned about balancing royal responsibilities with normal childhood development. But the most meaningful moment for James came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when Prince George approached him in the greenhouse, holding a healthy tomato that had grown from the plant James had given him months earlier. "Mr. James," the prince said, using the informal title they had developed for their new working relationship, "I want to thank you for something important. You helped me understand that being protected doesn't have to mean being isolated, and that helping others isn't something I have to wait until I'm king to do." James felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Your Highness, you figured that out on your own. I just helped create some opportunities." Prince George smiled and handed James the tomato. "Mr. Thompson says this is the best one from my plant so far. I thought you should have it since you started everything by caring about whether I was happy." As James accepted the simple gift, he realized that his decision to speak up had led to changes far beyond what he had originally imagined. Prince George wasn't just happier and more engaged. He was developing into exactly the kind of leader the country would need in the future. The boy was learning to balance duty with compassion, tradition with innovation, and royal responsibility with genuine human connection. That evening, James walked home through the streets surrounding the palace, passing houses where ordinary families lived ordinary lives. But now he knew that somewhere in the palace, Prince George was probably tending to his plants, reading a letter from Arthur, or planning how to help his friends in the gardening program with their next project. The future king was learning that leadership meant service, that privilege came with responsibility, and that the best way to prepare for governing people was to understand them, work with them, and care about their welfare. These lessons would shape not just Prince George's reign, but the kind of monarchy Britain would have for generations to come. James smiled as he reached his apartment, carrying the perfect tomato and the knowledge that sometimes protecting someone you care about requires having the courage to change everything about how that protection works. Prince George's silent but impactful choice to help Arthur had started a revolution in royal child rearing, and James had been honored to be part of building something better for the future king and the people he would one day serve.